Welcome to Freedom to Learn, the podcast that champions choice in education, defends parental rights, and exposes the harm caused by school unions. I'm Jenny Gentles, Director of Education Freedom and Parental Rights at DFI, the Defense of Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. Last month, Texas Governor Greg Abbott signed the nation's largest Day 1 universal school choice program into law. Today, we're talking with Madison Yandell, the governor's education advisor, and Vanessa Tanner, Chief of Staff to Texas House Public Education Committee Chairman Brad Buckley, about how education savings accounts, or ESAs, finally passed in Texas. We go behind the scenes and beyond the celebratory press releases and tweets to dig into the roles of various stakeholders in the legislative process: the governor, his office, the Texas House and its leadership, the Texas Senate, and advocacy organizations. Madison and Vanessa also explain the ESA program's funding, how the ESA program prioritizes vulnerable children, including students with disabilities and students from lower-income households, and the state comptroller's implementation responsibilities. Stick around for their responses to common misconceptions about the program. Madison Yandell and Vanessa Tanner, welcome to Freedom to Learn.
Thanks so much for having us.
Well, this is exciting. This is our first episode where we've had two guests, but it's really important because you all are representing the executive and the legislative perspectives on a big thing that happened in Texas this year, and that is the passage of the education savings account. So Madison, let's start with you. What is your role in Texas government?
So I'm the budget and policy advisor for K-12 education here in the office of the governor. So I sort of analyze, advise, help with policy development for all things education here in the governor's office.
What inspired you to work in education policy?
Yeah, so it actually started, I worked in the legislature before coming to the governor's office and worked for a member who was on the education committee. And that's where I sort of first started kind of dabbling in education policy. And then when I came to the governor's office in 2018, the state was in the midst of a school finance commission to try to finally sort of overhaul and modernize our school finance system. And so that was kind of my first step into education policy. And I'm sure it is in other states, but in Texas, our school finance system is kind of a beast, trying to figure out a way to fund education for 5.6 million kids. So I kind of got hooked working on that. And then that's what I've done since.
Yeah, the history of equity and adequacy lawsuits, history of education finance is a very long and complicated one. So that's awesome that it appealed to you, because that is forever going to be a challenge in education policy. Vanessa, you're the Chief of Staff for Texas State Representative Brad Buckley. What role do you and does he play in Texas education policy?
Sure. So my boss is the chairman of the House Public Education Committee. This was his second legislative session to chair the committee back in February of 2023. So when he first was named chair of the committee, and I had no knowledge of the education policy world as I would come to know it at the time. My boss had served on the school board. He had served on the committee before, so he and his wife is an educator. He comes from a long line of educators, so he was very familiar, very passionate, and I got to learn from him and many others throughout the process, with great friends like Madison helping me along the way to learn about just the various differences of different perspectives that people have in this policy world, because there is quite a lot of differences. And as we talk about here, everyone has a very big interest in education because everyone went to school, or they have a child, or their family member is an educator. In one way or another, education touches all of our lives. And so everyone has a very big interest in this issue.
I think that I was looking at your bio when I saw livestock intern in your history. Do I have that right? Or is that somebody else? Was that you?
Madison, for sure.
That was mine.
Okay. Yeah. So you all didn't have to go down this path of working in education policy. Various forces resulted in that. I became familiar with your work and your roles through the Education Reformers Academy. Can we touch briefly on what that is and what your involvement is? Madison, we'll start with you.
Yeah. So Education Reformers Academy, it's a policy fellowship of sorts. The organization brings together what was most interesting to me, people from sort of all kind of angles of education policy. So there were other governor's advisors, other like legislative staff like Vanessa, but then also school leaders and sort of persons from like education nonprofits or who didn't have as much on the policy side, but know the actual sort of on the field or in the field sort of landscape. So we did like a very quick and dirty 3-month deep dive into kind of the main topics really in education policy, from school choice to assessment and accountability policy to school finance, and heard from kind of key players like yourself from all across the country that are either kind of on the ground or have deep background in policy making. And so that was Vanessa and I obviously known each other for a long time before that, but I think got to know each other even better through that experience.
That's great. And Vanessa, you said you didn't have education experience. Is that one reason that you wanted to participate in that?
I needed a deep dive on all sorts of education issues, and we got that every week. We had really great informative policy sessions with people from across the country, leaders in education. And it was a really great opportunity for me to really be able to put some time aside to learn about whether it was accountability or curriculum, school choice, whatever it may be. We got to do really great deep dives and ask my dumb questions, and also hear from just the members of our cohort that have a different perspective than we might in Texas and have seen things differently than we have. So it was a really great opportunity for us to network, to learn, and really enjoyed our experience.
Yeah, what a fantastic opportunity to share across the states what's doing, because that's something that I want to talk about today. Sometimes the news doesn't make it outside the state capitol, doesn't make it outside the state borders. Folks don't hear what's going on with other states, and they can't learn from each other. So thankful for Education Reformers Academy and the opportunity that provides. Let's talk about education savings accounts in Texas. And let's start with the historic significance of this passing. I read that the House voted 85 to 63 in the wee hours of the morning on April 17th to approve a bill authored by Representative Brad Buckley to establish an education savings account program. So given the fact that close to 20 states have education savings accounts, I think it's 17 states have universal education freedom programs right now. Over 30 states have some kind of private school choice or ESA program. This doesn't sound like a big deal, but it was a big deal. So how difficult was it to get to this point, especially when we're talking about the Texas House?
Sure. Well, I think, Texas is Texas. We have a really great public school community in all of our different parts of Texas. And in some areas, our public schools are the largest employer. And, we love our Friday night lights. Texas will always support our public schools. But for folks who wanted just another option for their kids, it seemed to be a little difficult for us to help message that to folks. I understand, we're not trying to come after public schools. We're trying to help support each student. And so just educating folks for the last several years is, I think, what we needed to do was to help better educate and make sure that we put in the safeguards that folks wanted for the program, and to ensure that, every student, every parent had the opportunity to find the right school that fit them. And it was just a large part in messaging and talking to members and staff and advocates to really try to, I want to say persuade them, but also just educate them on what our ultimate goal was just helping each student, because we all know that every student has very unique needs. And, for me and my family, we moved different school districts because we know where we want to send our child to school, but we had that opportunity to do so. And I can drive a little bit longer to come to work, and that's okay with us. But not every family has that opportunity. So really just talking through with members and with the governor's office, and it took a village to definitely get this done. So I don't know, Madison, from your perspective.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do think it had to be sort of a true kind of coalition effort, making sure, because I think this is probably true across the country, that there, even within sort of the school choice advocate community, can be a lot of sort of disagreement about how things work, and especially from a launch of a program. So kind of, I think our office really played a role in sort of trying to keep everybody together and make sure that we were, everybody was listening to everyone's concerns, and having to make sure, sometimes reality check people on, like, yes, we want this to be, a big, expansive program, but we also have to be realistic about what we can get past. And, I think too, our sort of other counterpart in this, Senator Creighton and the Light Gov's office also, I think, really were super helpful in that, because school choice had passed the Senate numerous times. It was not an issue for them. But they, I think, did a really good job of working with Vanessa and her boss and all of us on making sure that, they were also being realistic about what could be passed on the House side, and trying to be cognizant of, either not putting things in a bill to go over to the House and those sorts of things, to try to sort of smooth out any issues before, just being realistic about what could finally pass. But I think we were all sort of pleasantly surprised to end up where we did, and that we ended up with a better, actually more expansive bill than we even anticipated 2.5 years ago.
Well, you mentioned that the ESA proposals have passed the Senate, and they've passed the Senate many times over many years. Was this the first time that this passed the House?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. So when we hear the House voted 85-63, again, we might think, well, that was easy. No.
Right. Yeah.
This was not easy getting to this point. We regularly say on this podcast that clear and strong leadership is essential for getting big education freedom proposals passed. So how has Governor Abbott expressed his support for education freedoms? I know he's held events around the state. He's not just issuing press releases, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, it really all started fall 2022. The governor made it very clear that, there was sort of a mandate from voters and Texans that parents needed to be put back in the driver's seat for their kids' education. And so from there, education freedom became sort of number one priority for the governor, both on school choice, but then also several reforms sort of within the public school system too, when it comes to parental rights and making sure that parents can get their concerns addressed and are, heard, that they know, they have sort of, they have access to anything that their kid is being taught or seeing in a school, those sorts of things. So it really was, the kind of, landmark issue was school choice, but it was more than that. It was sort of a kind of reshifting the way we view education from that matter. And part of that is because we had already made significant investments on the school finance side, but we were still sort of, we passed a huge school finance bill in 2019, and then the pandemic happened, and it sort of created a bunch of new issues that we just kind of weren't aware of. So I think that was sort of the kind of catalyst for a lot of this. And then after we didn't get it passed in 2023, the governor doubled down, made it very clear that was going to be his key campaign issue, and that was, he was going to work with other leadership to make sure that this happened.
I believe in 2023, he was saying something along the lines of we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Yes. So the harder way would be ensuring that legislators who were not supportive did not receive his support coming into the elections leading to this legislative session. People might not know Texas meets every other year, right? Yeah. Okay. So Vanessa, Representative Buckley, former school board member, his wife, I think, is an assistant superintendent. You said she was an educator as well. So she's an assistant superintendent of a school district. Why has he become such a strong advocate for school choice?
Yeah, it really started. He has this really great special needs private school in his district called Oak Creek Academy. His lifelong friend owns the school. She started the school. She was a special education teacher in the public schools and just really saw a need to create something a little bit more tailored to student specific needs. And he visits the school regularly. He's a veterinarian by day. So he comes often not as a state representative, but as a veterinarian to bring animals and visit with the students. And he's met with the families at this school who've gone to a public school and are who have just looked for something else. They needed something different for their child. This school charges, I believe it's around $9,000 a year, which for a special needs private school is pretty incredible. But also, families are making so many sacrifices to send their kids there. My boss has formerly Fort Hood, Fort Cavazos in his district. Lots of military families come through his community. And he had an E3 in the Army and a mom who was working two jobs that their grandmother had moved in to their house from out of state to help support them so that they could send their child with special needs to this great, great school. And for him, it's always been, if we can't help those families who are making such significant sacrifices, then what are we doing here? So this has been something very important, near and dear to his heart and in his community for some time. So that's where it really all started for him. And, for me, I got to see it firsthand by visiting the school as well and visiting with the families. And so it's been a really, I've had a really good front row view to what parents have experienced and what they're trying to do with the sacrifices that they're making for their kids.
I saw somewhere that another state legislator said, I can't imagine anyone being a better author and spokesman for this bill than Brad Buckley. And I wonder if telling those family stories was a part of being a spokesman for the bill.
Absolutely. And I think also, again, comes from a long line of public school educators and served on the school board. And so for him, it wasn't about an either or. This is just an extra tool in the toolbox for parents to have. And so he's always been a really good voice for this issue because he knows that the vast majority of Texas students will always go to public schools, and we need to do everything we can to support our public schools and our educators. But we also know that not every student is served best by their local public school. And just providing an extra option for those parents and those families, it's best for those families, those students, but it's also better for the state and the future of this, the future of our great state here. So he's always had a very good perspective on it. And we were very fortunate that he was the leader on the House side for this issue.
Was there a clear delineation of who was in charge of communicating the need for ESAs internally to legislators versus who was the chief communicator to the public? I was wondering, did that sort out like one of y'all's bosses versus the other in those roles? Or did everybody need to do everything?
Well, it was a lot of everybody doing everything. And we like all kind of political parties right now, there are factions at the party, and who we would, work with different leaders in kind of our own party to really message certain parts of the bill and answer questions through those members. We kind of had what I call team captains on our side, really helping educate members and answer their questions. And then as needed, bringing in experts kind of from the coalition world that we had here in Texas to help answer with any of the really small details of a bill, which is a lot of small details in a bill like this. So that's where we, on the House side especially, we really utilized our kind of leaders in the party to help with members understand the bill.
Madison, would you say the governor's job was to stay focused on talking with legislators, or was he more the external communicator on this?
once the legislature came into session, it really did sort of, I mean, we had dozens of meetings, some one-on-one, some kind of strategically in groups, particularly with, we had a large class of freshman members. And so sort of talking with them, and a lot of them, school choice was sort of the key issue, either because that, the governor was supporting them on that matter, or because they sort of came in with this wave of conservative members. And so and a lot of it too was sort of reinforcing that my boss and Chairman Buckley were a team, and he wanted to make it very clear that if you were going against Brad Buckley, you were going against the governor, and that I think was really sort of the most important to him, to make sure that they knew that the governor was backing Chairman Buckley and trusted him, and knew that he kind of wanted to make sure to empower him to be able to work the chamber. And I think really sort of probably one of the biggest changes that happened was that we had a new speaker, and that who has been a staunch supporter of school choice, and made it very clear that this, the House was going to get this done. There was no question. And so I think that sort of that undoubtedly changed things. But then, throughout too, sort of we would say, okay, Vanessa, like, who remembers that who are you worried about right now? Who do we need to touch base with? Who do we need to sort of just check in with and make sure that they're okay? And so it was a lot of that throughout session leading up to when they got to the House floor, just trying to, if we heard rumors that somebody was starting to, waiver, or as it came to the bill being on the House floor, somebody talking about that they're going to put an amendment on there, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. We would talk with those members, sort of reinforce, the team spirit, and, making sure that everybody, it wasn't a lack of communication that would cause anybody to have consternation. So that, I think, sort of we play offense or defense kind of based on what was needed.
Well, to piggyback off that, what Madison said about the speaker, our new speaker, Speaker Burrows was instrumental in getting this done. And he made it very clear from the very beginning that we would have a universal school choice program and a large school finance package, as we called it, the Texas two-step. I think if people weren't clear, maybe a month before we had the bill on the House floor, the speaker was instrumental in getting us the 76 co-authors we needed for the bill. And so right away, even before it was on the floor, we knew we had the support we needed to get this bill across the finish line.
All right, I'm hearing a lot of different dynamics there, because you mentioned that the Senate was a partner in ensuring that you're putting forward a bill that could pass the House. And then the speaker was involved, the governor, and then your boss, the education chair. So this is a lot of dynamics. And then I wanted to layer on top of that the outside advocacy groups, who of course all claim that they got school choice through through the Texas legislature and onto the governor's desk, with the recognition, of course, that you guys did a lot of work and in this process. But what would you say the role of the outside advocacy group were?
Yeah, well, I mean, I really think first and foremost was sort of making sure, educating the public, but then also just encouraging people to reach out, so that it wasn't just members getting calls about hate for school choice and the hate mail, but also that they were hearing that there are people back in their district that do want this and do support this. And I think that really, that's always helpful for members, sort of to know that this isn't just something they're doing because they're being told, but there are people in their district that are passionate about this and care a lot about it. And so I think that that was probably the most kind of important piece of this, because I do think, I mean, it's kind of like most things, your opposition is generally the loudest and the one that's making calls and showing up at the Capitol and that sort of thing. That's how it tends to be. So making sure that there was sort of the positive side of things, I think was really important. And then also too, so helpful just in sort of educating members. Like, there were so many members, and I mean, even I, coming into this 2.5 years ago, didn't I generally kind of had an idea of an education savings account, but not so much the nitty gritty and how much, how it would actually work. And so they were really helpful in sort of explaining to members. And, I think particularly, Texas Public Policy Foundation, but then also on the other side are actual sort of school leaders. So the Texas Catholic Conference and our Private School Association, who have been, they are kind of the first to have been advocating for this 25 years ago, but then also like they know how schools operate and how families make those sorts of decisions and how families truly can be supported through a program like this. So, I think that's always helpful for it's one thing for us to come every day and say, okay, yeah, this is what the bill does and this is how it'll work. It's another thing for people who will actually be sort of on the ground, either operating schools or working directly with families to come and say, like, no, this is crafted to work for us, and it will work, and this will sort of change how families kind of move within our education system.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about what education savings accounts are and the substance of what was passed and then signed into law. Sometimes in my world, we throw around the acronyms a little bit and then just assume, what an ESA is, right?
Right.
But let's talk about what we're talking about. And we can start with what it is. And broadly, an education savings account, an ESA, is something that's not just a voucher. It's not just a set amount of funding for a set number of participating private schools that the families can access and use at those participating private schools. This is broader. They can use it for a wide array of educational options, including tutoring, technology, educational technology, and services for students with disabilities. Was that in there as well? This is beyond just private school tuition. So this was how much money for approximately for participating students?
There was a $1 billion appropriation with, we're estimating probably somewhere between 70 to maybe 90,000 students could potentially be served. And so it'll roll out in the fall of 26. A couple of key provisions that will kind of make that number fluctuate is we put in a provision for special needs students to receive what they are entitled to in a public school, up to 30,000. So we wanted to make sure that we heard a lot from special education advocates that roughly approximate $10,000 ESA wouldn't be enough to serve a special needs student. So we took those concerns and we made sure that we put enough funding and put it in the bill to what they could receive to make sure that they can get the services that they do require.
Do they need to have an IEP in order to prove eligibility?
An IEP in order to receive the additional dollars over the ESA amount.
Okay, and so we're talking $1 billion set aside. There's a lot of talk out there about how this is the biggest day one. This will be the biggest day one launch of an education freedom program, and that makes sense that it's the biggest because Texas is so big. But what I hear you saying is that only a smaller percentage of students are going to be able to participate. How many K-12 students do you have statewide?
5.5 million.
5.5 million, but you said how many students might be able to participate initially?
So it's roughly $10,000 ESA, and so with expenses and that the program will obviously have, we're looking at probably somewhere between 70 to 90,000. Madison, sounds about right.
Right. So the sky's not going to fall. All students are not going to leave public education and participate in the ESA program. And what I hear you saying is that those students with disabilities are going to receive that additional funding. So if the parents choose to participate, they will have the additional dollars. And will they also be prioritized as far as being able to access the ESAs?
Yes. Madison.
So we have sort of a tiered priority, and those students, regardless of income, are first in line, along with what we kind of call our kind of first tier, with the kind of lower percentage of the federal poverty line. And so I think it's kind of critical. And when Vanessa was mentioning too, so the IEP, so you have to have an IEP to be used to sort of determine what your funding amount would be over the base amount, but a student will only need a diagnosis to qualify through that priority side. So if they don't yet have an IEP or just not something that their parents want to do, that is not a requirement to be prioritized.
Right. And IEP is the individualized education program, which is something typically that students would have through a public school district in order to be able to access public education. So an IEP doesn't necessarily apply or inform what students are going to need as far as services and accommodations at the private school. They can work with the private school to come up with a services plan that will include services that they'll still be able to access at the district, because that is a federally funded thing. Okay, so that's exciting when you're talking about prioritizing vulnerable students, high needs students, both the students with disabilities and the lower income families, and then that's 80% for the students with disabilities and the lower income families, and then 20% for the general population. Or was I reading something that was mischaracterizing it?
Yeah, so it is actually going to be, I guess that's technically correct. So we have priorities 1, 2, 3, and 4, and which creates a universal program. Priorities 1, 2, and 3 would be about 80%. And then priority 4 is for families making over 500% of the federal poverty limit at level. That is limited to 20% of the appropriation.
All right.
Theoretically, 100% could be taken up by those first three tiers.
Absolutely.
If sufficient applications come in. Yeah. Okay. Well, and then let's turn to the implementation, because the way to ensure that those families, the vulnerable students, when we're talking students with disabilities, lower income students, find out about the program, you've got to get implementation right. So there's time to do that, right? You said that it doesn't begin until next year. Is that right?
The program will roll out technically in the fall of 26. That'll be the first school year that a student would be enrolled in an ESA program, but applications will begin in January of 26.
Okay. Do you all turn it over to other folks as far as the implementation and making sure that families find out about the options? Like, what happens next?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly still a team effort. So our comptroller of public accounts, so our state treasurer, is the one tasked with administering the program. There are also several pieces, both statutorily and then also just by nature, that they'll work with our Texas Education Agency to implement pieces of the bill. But yeah, there's a lot. I mean, I think we've all been meeting with comptroller staff regularly now, sort of, and they want feedback from our office and from the authors and sponsor of the bill. But it is, sort of still a team effort. We also have a very interesting situation in that our comptroller, who is independently elected here in Texas, is resigning to go to a university system. And so my boss will actually be appointing the new comptroller. And so they'll be in a situation of kind of leadership change. And so there's a lot happening at that agency right now. So I think even more so they're leaning on legislative leadership, and our office was, sort of, and just obviously the political scrutiny that this program already has and will have. There's like, we don't want this to be all on us as far as the decision making. So very, very much still a team effort now that we're in implementation.
And will their role be to directly process the funding reimbursements that the families are asking for the education savings account, or will there be some sort of interim entity for that? How does that work?
Yes, they're currently going through the process right now, looking for a certified educational assistance organization, leaving that up to them, how they decide they're going to do that. The bill allowed for up to 5 of those organizations. Whether they choose 1 or 2 or 3, we kind of we're leaving it to the comptroller to decide how best to do that. So we might be seeing, you could see something where it's one organization handling everything from marketing the program, to taking the applications, to being the marketplace, or whatever it may be. But you could also have several different organizations in charge of something very specific at the same time. So leaving that to the comptroller to decide. The bill was not super specific in that regard. We wanted to make sure that we allowed for a lot of flexibility to make sure that the comptroller had what they needed to do to go find the best people to help manage the program.
This isn't a new thing. Again, like Texas is a little late to the ESA, to the Education Savings Account world. So you do have plenty of other states to look to see how these contracts are working, how these entities that do provide that service are performing. So hopefully that's something that Texas can benefit from. You're not the pioneers, and can ensure that you are implementing best practices there. One provision that I kind of hesitate to bring up, because I would imagine it was somewhat controversial while you all were talking about it during the legislative session, and that's how the program will be monitored, maybe specifically how testing will work. That often is a contentious issue. So participants, how will they be monitored or tested?
Yeah. So it's a requirement of the bill that students who are, the private schools who are administering or who are choosing to participate in the program, those students must take a nationally norm reference test. That the testing piece was certainly one of the very controversial pieces. But I think this was also where our team captains kind of came into play on the House side, sort of making clear that, if parents are choosing to leave the kind of state education system, why would we be requiring the student to take a state test? That's not, our test is developed meticulously to be aligned to our state standards. So that was certainly a battle. But it also too, it was not a huge issue for the private schools. As part of their accreditation, they require all of their schools to administer a nationally norm reference test. So it didn't change anything for their practice. And we still allow the option, if a parent does want to know, wants to know where their student stands sort of on compared to the state standards, they have the option of their student being administered the STAR test. If that's something they want to do, they may be curious, now that my student's not in the public school, where are they performing sort of compared to public school students? So they do at least have the option, but given its practice for private schools to administer the nationally norm reference test, we imagine most will take that option.
Madison, I feel like you said something very important there, that accredited Texas private schools offer nationally norm reference tests. Like, there's such a myth and misconception out there that if you aren't attending a public school, it is unaccountable, and parents and society have no idea how the schools are performing. My daughter, who just graduated from a K-8 private school in Virginia, took the MAP testing, the NWEA MAP testing 3 times a year. I knew exactly how she was doing. I saw her growth, and wasn't always growth, but generally growth over time, and then how she compared nationally to other students. I don't need her to take this state test. I'm good. I also had homework coming home every day, because it was a more traditional private school where they still use pencil and paper, and lots of homework and lots of assignments coming home every day that I could look at. So lots of accountability built into these schools. And I'm hearing you say that that's part of the program as well. Anything else on the mechanics of the program, on the implementation, that you all would want to address?
We're really excited. It's been a long time coming. We're just making sure that we go through the rollout properly, and that we're staying engaged, involved in the implementation process, and making sure that families are aware. Because that's, we live in our bubble here. We know all about this program, but making sure Texas is a very large state, and making sure that folks, in the Panhandle, down to the Rio Grande Valley, and from El Paso to Houston, know about the program and know their options.
Yeah. And I think a big sort of piece too is, especially for a first year, looking at the first year launch, like really thinking through too, to make sure we're balancing sort of, innovation, which is sort of the whole point of the ESA, is sort of more innovative options, but then, ensuring sort of a smooth launch, prioritizing like Vanessa said, making sure that parents are sort of aware of it, so that they can apply and access. And then also it's very clear how that they know how it operates. And I think we at least we had our sort of first foray into this with our, we called it supplemental special education services, our sort of public school special education ESA. And so there are at least, we have, sort of a population of parents that are already kind of familiar with the concept, at least. And I think that will sort of help within the community special education parents who are going to be somewhat skeptical about kind of leaving the public school system. But I think that there are those parents who have already, and we get, TEA in my office and we just hear countless stories from those families and how life-changing it was for them. And some actually ended up leaving public school once they sort of saw that, they didn't necessarily need the safety net of the public school for their student, that they actually had a pretty good idea of what their child needed, and that they could actually make those decisions on their own.
Yeah, and I'll add, just piggyback off that, we got a lot of really not great calls for a long time. But the moment we passed the bill, that next week, we got calls that asked from families asking, where can I apply? So it was really such a great feeling to know that, all this work we've been doing, while we know that there are families out there, to get the other calls, really wanting to be engaged and know what they needed to do, what their next steps are. That was really just a gratifying feeling for all of us.
Yeah, it'll be really exciting to watch all of this roll out. As we wrap up this conversation about Texas's new ESA program, I'd love to hear the ESA school choice education freedom myth that you all heard the most during legislative session, and perhaps like what your recommendation to your boss was in responding. Of course, the news clips that you see online are, a lot of folks saying that this favors wealthy families, will deepen educational disparities. Was that a lot of what you were hearing?
Yes, we heard a lot of that, and we know that that's not true. And I'd say, our whole goal has always been to prioritize Texas' most vulnerable students, and that's what the bill does. And so we have been very confident from the beginning that is what our goal was, that's what drives us to pursue this program. And that's why it was prioritized, but also recognizing that, income levels across the state are also very different. So when you do these different poverty levels, $160,000 in Austin, Texas is a lot different than in Harlingen, Texas, in the Valley. So it's just, it was important for us to try to educate that to the members here and to the community, and, all of the outside noise we were hearing from. But, we know where we stood on it. We know that this program will be geared towards our most vulnerable students. So that was really important to us.
Madison, what was the myth that you heard the most that you'd want to respond to?
I think at least, we kind of covered too the idea that, this won't benefit kind of average Texans, but I think too, sort of the rural myth of that this won't benefit rural Texans, but then at the same time will destroy rural Texas, was always sort of, and I'm from a small town, about 1,000 people, Holiday, Texas. And so it's kind of like, I think I'm pretty aware of, my family made enormous sacrifice so that all my sisters and I could go through Montessori and start, with a Catholic education. And then we moved to public school, but we also went to a public school that we weren't zoned to. We drove and we were transfer students. And then my sisters then moved back to our zoned school. And so we kind of seen all the different kind of options. And so the idea that most, the vast majority of Texans do live within driving distance of a private school, but we also have a very vast homeschooling community here in Texas. And I saw, sort of the Wichita Falls area in Northwest Texas has a very robust homeschool community. And, so that they're already sort of, that's already a population that can benefit from this. But I think there are also a lot of families, too, that, for whatever circumstances, the traditional public school doesn't fit for them, or theirs doesn't, but they don't really have another option near them. So that one was to me sort of the most frustrating, because a lot of times it was one coming from people who actually don't understand rural Texas and know rural Texas. But then two, it was always sort of a double argument of this is both going to destroy rural Texas, but also not benefit rural Texas, which was always a very confusing one for me of, okay, which one is it? But and I think part of it too was sort of, as Vanessa alluded to earlier, we can do both. We can make enormous investment in public education and provide parents the option. And so, working very closely with those school leaders who were just kind of like, okay, we just want to, we think we already know what's coming on the school choice side. Let's talk about what, we would just want to talk about what our schools need and how we can move forward. So I think that was really, really key too, and sort of not talked about outside of the Capitol, how the commitment that was made to also, to do both. I think that went a long way for a lot of kind of school leaders and kind of those communities as well.
So this Texas two-step first was passing the ESA, and then there was this large investment in Texas public schools. How big of an investment was this, Bill?
$8.5 billion.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it was a big deal.
And from what I understand, like a portion of that is supposed to go to teacher and staff pay raises, right? Was there a mechanic in there to make sure that it goes to that?
Yes, we created the teacher retention allotment, and so really focused on keeping teachers in the classroom, and really, so we did it for our 3-year and 5-year educators. And some parts of Texas, they'll be receiving an $8,000 teacher pay raise that the state will continue to support. And so that varied across the state, the amount, but the top range is around $8,000 for teacher pay raises, and mostly in our rural communities where we see a big pay gap there for our teachers. So wanted to make sure we were supporting our educators in rural Texas, but of course across the whole state we're seeing it. And so that was really important to both the House, the Senate, and the governor's office to make sure that we did. But also included in that was a number of policy reforms in that $8.5 billion, everything from, educator prep to our reading academies and math academies, CTE, which I know is super important to the governor. And I know Madison knows a lot more about, but we did a number of things for not only to just put dollars into the classroom, but truly make different policy reforms that will help better educate our students and help, ultimately help our workforce down the road.
Well, Madison and Vanessa, thank you for your commitment to education freedom and empowering parents. And thank you for joining Freedom to Learn.
Thank you so much for having us.
Freedom to Learn is a production of the Defense of Freedom Institute. You can learn more about DFI at dfipolicy.org. If you have feedback or suggestions for future podcasts, please reach out to us at podcast@dfipolicy.org. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and leave a rating and review wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.